Here we are. Well, thank you. Thanks very much for joining us. So actually, we're going to start where the last panel finished, which was the media bill. 2 weeks ago, around about this time, we didn't know it was coming, and now we know an election is coming. And the first question on many of our lips and in our heads, I'm sure for all of you in the room, was, will the media bill be passed by Friday? And it was. And that, I think, opened up prominence, opportunities for prominence for all of the PSBs, production, for Channel 4, some regulation of the VOD. So a whole host of really important measures for the industry. But I want to start by asking each of you your reflections on the bill and what it means for you. Maybe I'll start with you, Alex.
Surely everyone's first question was, do they have no umbrellas? That was surely the first question.
Apart from the guy with the speaker, yeah.
That's the first question on the day. Look, the Media Act now, I think it's great. You know, the key thing here is, although it has been fascinating to hear from all these streamers for the past couple of hours, is how do we ensure that public service content is prevalent, easy to find, and at the center of things, particularly for young people. And I think all of us, that has been our focus on the most important thing in the Media Act. Because if it isn't, we're in a very sort of dangerous position societally.
So a question of discovery for those audiences.
Discovery and in your face all the time.
Yeah. And Tim, from your perspective?
Yeah, I thought it was overdue, well judged, and good news. We just now need to push on. So I think it was just a marker, a very important marker. I mean, there's a number of things in there, and this room is probably much more into the detail. It wasn't the first thing in my mind, by the way. There were, it was, you know, what do we had on that? What was on the telly that night, or whatever. I mean, honestly, we need to focus on the big stuff, but the appropriate prominence, and that I would have liked significant prominence, by the way, for PSBs, because I think we have a big choice, which I've said many times, which is you've got to decide and intervene appropriately, driven by what audiences want, on how much focus you want on your domestic services, your public service broadcasters with the things they do. And I happen to think, you know, I'm all for markets, but I happen to think we need to media is one of those sectors where you need to actively manage it and not drift, and decide what you're building from a societal point of view. And everyone knows I'm on a soapbox at the moment because 75% of the world doesn't have a free media. So there are big things at play in these choices. What we do need to do is, with some urgency, enact these things and get on with it and build a future focus. It's exciting. We're the best in the flipping world at this. And we need to get cracking and show what this means. And I'm actually very pleased by the Media Act. And now we get on with it and we work with partners and we get the prominence for PSB and we get the so-called ecosystem working in a digital age. That's good fun.
Yeah. And as you say, the sort of word appropriate is slightly unhelpful, isn't it? Because it's less clear in terms of what it actually specifically might mean for you in terms of sort of laws and regulations and so on. I mean, Sarah, from a sort of an audience experience perspective, how do you think it might change? How do you think the audience experience might evolve over the sort of next few years as that beds in and we work out what appropriate means?
Well, I hope it means that the audience continues to find us. I mean, the audience shouldn't notice. The media bill, we've spent 20 years lobbying and talking about it. Yeah. And suddenly it comes along in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Thank goodness, and thanks to everyone in the room that's worked on it. But the audiences don't care. They just want to find content. And the danger of the whole thing is if they don't find our content, we've already heard this morning, they'll find billions of pounds worth of other content. So the audiences shouldn't notice, but they should be continued to receive the level of service that we are all collectively seeking to deliver to them, which is, I mean, the streamer's story, which we'll come to, is extraordinary this morning, but it makes me all the more convinced that the British content and the local provision of content has to fight to find its way against such well-funded global organisations.
Yeah, and then Julian, I guess from your perspective, I should say, and I spoke to you about this before, we do have apologies from Carolyn McCall today, who has a PLC board strategy away day, so she sends her apologies.
I'm the understudy.
And her...
Very good to have you.
You're too kind.
I think we're all the lucky ones here, Julian. But I mean, again, do you think, can you see changes to the kind of content that you might be producing and distributing coming as a result, or is it, as the others have said, just a kind of, can we just now get on with this?
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think it's really important. You know, I'm a great believer, a great supporter in the public service broadcasting system. It's absolutely vital for our culture, our democracy, our national identity, all the things we know. with my producer's hat on, it is also the cornerstone, the foundation stone of a world-class production sector. And it is easy to forget, just how important that production sector is. Half of the world's unscripted formats were originated and devised from these shores. Outside of the US, we are the biggest exporter of scripted television in the world. As you heard just from the previous session, we attract hundreds of millions of inward investment from Hollywood studios and the like. And the cornerstone of that is the PSB system. It cannot be underestimated, in terms of its influence and importance. In a number of different ways. The way in which, consistently high levels of originations and spend in original commissions. Obviously, it's very, very welcome that we have, streamers coming in and commissioning shows. That's fantastic. But it is still ultimately eclipsed here in the UK by the scale and magnitude of the commissions from the PSBs. And then within that, you have a huge range of commissioning. Again, you can't underestimate this stuff. From arts to specialist factual to drama to documentaries, whole range of things. Commissioning outside of London. The British production sector outside of London would look radically different if it wasn't for the PSBs. And talent, something very close to my heart. The way in which PSBs consistently over years have backed talent, so important. Jesse Armstrong, the writer showrunner of arguably one of the greatest dramas of all time, Succession, backed for years by Channel 4. Phoebe Waller-Bridge, backed by the BBC by Channel 4. Look at the soaps, the soaps backing some of the greatest dramatists of this country. Paul Abbott, Russell T Davies, Kay Mellor, Sally Wainwright. They all came and grew from working with PSBs. And then the last thing I would say is that, we with the PSBs, if you're a producer, there is still the presumption, and again, this came up in the previous panel, still the presumption that as a producer, when you sell to one of these guys, that you have an ownership position over your show. You can share in the value of what was created. So the PSB system needs all the help it can get because we need it to be as healthy and vibrant as possible in order to sustain this world-class production sector.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks all. Just to push, I'm interested in this point on discoverability, because I think that, it's very easy to sort of talk about your content on the platforms where your content is. How do you think about finding those audiences which are on, who are on the platforms, who don't necessarily know the brilliance of what you're all producing, and how is that? Is that a collective endeavour? Is that individual efforts? I don't know, let me start.
Well, I think if you go back to what's the difference and what are we here for and why do we care so much about this? And it might sound like a bit highfalutin, but the truth is that if you're in public service broadcasting, the issues now for people in the UK are we're engaged in a battle for truth and for trust. That's globally true, but in the UK we have a particular advantage in the market of public service broadcasting. And that battle for truth and trust is very different to something that's aggregated and algorithmically served. That is a different business and it is a different purpose. And I would say it's one that's societally very important here. It's important for national resilience, and that's the core of what we do. Now, that's particularly important for young people. We're in an age of democratic disengagement. If you survey people in the UK, if you're over 56, 26% of people say, I'd like a strong leader who does away with national assemblies and elections. But now, if you're 18 to 35, that's risen. 35% of people say that. So we're in a really difficult position globally in Britain in terms of society, in terms of how people feel. So I think if you talk to all of us, that's why we believe public service broadcasting is important. We're happy with loads of competition, but it's got a different purpose. Now, to engage, we've all got to do our own business fighting for attention. We've got to be on the platforms. For young people, you've got to be on Snap, you've got to be on Instagram, you've got to be on TikTok, you've got to be on whatever comes next. You can't just be in your own way. You can't not evolve the business. And we also work together. So things like Freely, that's us working together because that is a jointly shared mission, no matter how much fun we might have being competitive about shows. I think everyone feels that that's what the purpose of public service broadcasting is.
Does anybody want to chip in on that?
Well, I think the first thing is there's definite opportunity for us to work together in areas like freely. We have a rich history, actually, of working together, almost like a kind of big hedge against just purely those with most scale dictating distribution. And, this is about, weirdly, it's listening to this conversation, I don't think it's purely a kind of the dusty old PSBs getting into a defensive crouch and saying, just protect us. I think it's much more a growth. What kind of growth do you want from the creative industries? Mm-hmm. The story of growth is phenomenal. I mean, Julian said it very eloquently about what production is, our production sector. But many of the decisions we make are uneconomic. Okay? Now, this is really important because they are the right things to do, but they are uneconomic. Let me explain why. So when I set out the roles of the BBC, pursuing truth with no agenda, as per Alex's point, homegrown content, bringing people together rather than... Actually, some of those economic choices might be consolidate all of the BBC into London. Yeah? Just look for efficiency. Because at that point, if I was owned as a public company, I'd be, or a listed public company, as opposed to the public's organisation, you're just looking for a different return. And that's not... I mean, I love the businesses we've seen this morning. They're phenomenal. The value stories are amazing, and the content is wonderful, and that is all to be... I really mean that. It's all to be applauded. But if you're interested in something with a different role... So as I push money out of... I'm a real big believer in pushing money out of London, local creativity, and out of that comes Blue Lights, but it also comes the biggest rating show in linear television, which is 6:30 regional news. Yeah? Netflix ain't doing that. And I think we need to be in a position... I mean, I deny my filthy marketing past on a regular basis, but if you go way back, this industry loves it. If you go back a few decades, many, many decades, I remember when gondola ends were for sale in Boots, and it was literally the person who spent the most money got the sales. And it was brutal, and it was about scale and money. If you purely want a single dimension in the industry, I think we can see what that leads to globally. I don't want that. Okay, it's not defensive. I want to grow an industry in a different way with different creative, storytelling outcomes, different societal outcomes. The thing for me is that is not about a choice for economic decline in the UK. Quite the reverse. In fact, some of the narrative that I think we need to own as PSBs is we provoke competition. We provoke it because we want open platforms. Freely is open, there's clues in the title, it's open to all. Yeah. We do not want closed environments. And we've seen all the businesses today go and have a good old scrap, and they'll all be differentiating themselves and they'll all be presenting in their way like we will. But I like a free open market. And I actually think the PSBs have been a factor in a properly competitive market. Yeah. So I don't think this is a load of people just entrenching themselves. It's a future vision for what we want to be from a societal and economic point of view.
There's also
go for it.
There's also an interplay between what we're seeking to do on our own channels and services and the relationship that we have with the streamers. It's not a them and us. Yeah. So if you had been looking at Netflix over the weekend, for example, top show was the TikTok dance doc, then comes Eric, and then Bridgerton, and then Rich House, Poor House from Channel 5, and then Buying London. It's number 6 today, I just checked. Now that is a show that we've had for a long time, that we help make our funding models because we distribute it elsewhere. But that 5 brand sits on that invested, algorithmic-driven platform and helps tell people what we stand for. We now have drama on Channel 5, 80 hours coming up. We didn't used to have it at all. Because of the funding model and because we can't fully underwrite it ourselves, we distribute elsewhere and we do deals with other people. It always finds its way onto Netflix. They always pick it up, and it's always in the top 10. It's very helpful for us. That's our brand on a big platform. That enables us then to invest content back into what Tim's talking about. 40% of our commissioned content is spent in nations and regions. It doesn't need to be. We choose to be because we think that's what our brand stands for. 80% of our peak time schedule is originations because we think that's what the audience wants, because we used to be an acquisitions-led channel. That wouldn't work anymore because the streamers take that space. To stand out and differentiate and make a brand that works, you have to speak to the audience that you cater for, and you have to acknowledge that the content you're producing for them needs to find its place elsewhere if it's really going to make impact.
Yeah, and that point about partnerships is really important, I think, with Sarah. That's the point that Sarah mentioned. I mean, it's absolutely right to say it's not just a binary world of sort of, the PSPs and the streamers. Certainly, if you're in production, you're interplaying both, constantly you know, Outlaws that's on the BBC at the moment. It's co-production with Amazon. And there are a myriad of different examples of that. And actually, I think one of the most interesting questions, certainly from a production point of view, is going to be, as many streamers are now increasingly looking towards profitability rather than just simply building subscriber numbers, I think that could and should generate an era of more creative deal making and more partnerships.
Agreed.
And I think we're already beginning to see the signs of some of that. I mean, you had Jan on earlier on. I mean, from Disney, you know, one of their Disney originals, Extraordinary, great little, great British comedy show, is now getting an airing on ITVX. You know, that thing of windowing, people sharing windows, partnering in new and different ways. I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, and I was sort of reflecting as you spoke. I guess there's a truth today which has been true almost forever, which is there are ups and downs in the slate, and you're all about serving your audiences. In a sense, that truth hasn't changed. I think what I've noticed in the last maybe 12 months or so is a recognition that we've all gained of the role of the PSBs. I think if we were sitting here on panels 3 or 4 years ago, there was a worry about, you know, what is the role of the PSBs? The streamers were investing beyond. But actually, we've seen the economics of that industry shift as well, and we're starting to now understand truth and trust, the roles of those, the roles of the PSB in society, the creative kind of heart of the economy. That feels a more positive and confident.
Well, also creative performance. It's really important, again, this kind of just failure. I mean, actually, the creative performance of the PSBs has been pretty damn good. And there's some really good shows. Really? I mean, we're in, see, I don't want to be a market failure provider. No. And by the way, that's what's happening around the world. I mean, I would suggest the audience spend a bit of time, this is a lecturing you, is on what's happening to PSB around the world. Yeah. It's scary.
You're completely right.
It's really problematic. I mean, not marginally troublesome. I would say we're in a red alert situation in many, many markets. And as politics gets more polarised, we've got to decide what we want to do with the institutions. Yeah. So the point here is, what's lovely about this place is, through the efforts of everyone, I think we're getting really good shows. I really agree with Julian as well. I think there'll be more partnerships. So we do great work with Warner Discovery in sport. Yeah, doing partnerships. We do great work with ITV, bringing the Euros and things. Yeah. That is absolutely, we don't need to dominate. We need to justify, in my world, we need to justify £169 per household. It's a pretty simple system. But to do that, I'm going to need partners. I can't do it with my budget alone. So I think that's quite exciting. I think there's plenty to be had. I think we can have models that are different. I think it gives US executives massive headaches to explain it to their parent companies, because we're kind of unique. But once you get through that, there's growth to be had.
Yeah, so we'll come back on that point in a second, because I suppose at a time of trust and truth and the kind of backing, if you like, of the media bill, like the idea of UK stories for UK audiences, being able to tell more assertive stories, some great stories over the last sort of 4 to 6 months, if I think about it. What do you think the sort of next 2-3 years of storytelling is going to bring? I mean, you know, are we going to see just a blossoming of more of these stories as people seek out trust and truth and stories that allow them to just really reflect on their lives? Or what do you think?
I'm not sure people do necessarily seek out trust and truth. I'm saying that's the battle we're engaged in. And the fact that people don't necessarily seek it out is why it's so important. But I think that what people get from what they see on PSBs when they're creatively strong and vibrant is different to what you get on a global player. For sort of 2 reasons. One is national identity. Like, I'm hard-pressed to think of a show that's been on a streamer that's had permanence to change and impact conversation in Britain. Maybe Clarkson's Farm, actually, because that did make people think about farming differently, which you wouldn't have expected. But I find it hard to go a list of whereas for all of us, I could come up with shows. So that's an important thing, because that's about what remains in the UK and how you make impact and how you make positive social impact. And that's partly because we're coming at things from a different perspective. We're not thinking about maximization of dwell time as the sole preserve of success, because when you are thinking about that, it leads you towards things that are only more salacious. It tends to lead you only towards the things that are bad for you or spiky. But that's not our sole motivation. That's the positives of it. So I think you'll see loads more of that. loads more of stories that are not parochial, but only mean something in Britain.
And Sarah, let me get you. I was going to say come to you, because I guess you are both the president of a really successful PSB brand that is succeeding at the moment by really knowing its audience and a great slate, but part of a much bigger global streamer.
I adjust the lens on a daily basis. I think this is one of the panels that might frustrate, because we're going to be in such violent agreement with each other for every question you ask us. But I do have a unique perspective. I mean, we are laser focused on what Channel 5 is about in this market, and we are clearer than ever on its point and purpose. And the reason I talk about how collectively it's important that we do agree with each other actually is we are part of a corner of the market. It's a very big corner. We are the envy of the world. And I spent my whole career in various of these seats in the commercial public service broadcasting, so I'm arguably not a very impartial witness. But in my role at Paramount, I've had responsibility for markets elsewhere, and obviously reporting to the US. I speak to my free-to-air counterparts in Australia and Latin America, looked after Canada and Israel. Everywhere you go, once you've explained what it means, they say they wish they had it. And it's not just our content and the way we speak to our audiences, it's the legislative regime that we operate under. The media bill is the envy of many other jurisdictions. It's the regulation that we operate under, the level of compliance, the broadcasting standards, and it's the ability of us to collaborate. You know, Freely comes out of Everyone TV, formerly known as Digital UK. We are equal shareholders in that business, and we are, as the public service broadcasters, therefore, Freesat having been folded in, control free-to-air television in the market. That plus the media bill, plus our investment in local content and local producers, is so potent, from which comes the export elsewhere in the world. So back to the bigger side of Paramount, I mean, it's a glorious alchemy, to be honest. We do a lot of production here, Mission Impossible's here. It's back to the legislative regime, the tax breaks and the improved tax system announced in the budget is good. We will do more VFX here, and others should as well. And to Jane's question in the previous panel, I think it's very healthy inward investment coming in, because it gives us much more opportunity to train people up. There is work for them. We invest as much as we can in SMEs. We care deeply about working with producers around the market, but we're not enough. You need to make this market as big as possible so it can stand on its own 2 feet, both globally and to sustain itself.
I'm quite optimistic about this content question. You asked about, what we can do creatively. Actually, it all links to the money in some ways, in terms of what the return path is for the money, because at the end of the day, the lovely thing about in the BBC is, we have our ups and downs, and it's somewhat publicly accountable. But that was irony. But I was waiting for a reaction. We're extremely publicly accountable and transparent. See the last 18 months. So the point is, though, that what we can do is we don't have to. We can be driven by data. I mean, I've got wonderful tech teams. We're looking at deployment of algorithms, all those things. But at the end of the day, we can also say, is it the right thing to do? That we don't have to make the numbers work on every single show. We can do things. Now, clearly, we're trying to get things that people... So think about The Sixth Sense. Think about what these guys did, in terms of ITV on Mr. Bates. This stuff is precious. And the other thing is audiences are coming in scale to those shows. So it's not as if this is, again, I keep coming back to it, this isn't like we're offering the kind of, enjoy your breakfast and, by the way, some very dry muesli on the side. We are actually developing shows that may not be perfect for, and this is not a criticism, an international, global business's economics, but the audience are responding to them.
And when you, just to jump in there, when you say audience, you mean the UK audience?
That's another great point. I'm primarily talking about the UK audience with exploitation in the US and beyond.
Well,
so we make for our home. The one thing you've got to do in my job, by the way, is make for the UK. We've got a £2 billion commercial arm. We're growing well. We're an international global operation, but you have to make your core market work. And by the way, talk to any company. You've got to make your core market work.
Can I? Yeah, I was going to.
Yeah, it's the same pretty much. I mean, we're in 13 different markets. We sell pretty much around the world. It's the same story pretty much everywhere. People have a natural gravitational pull towards stories that are about their community, their world, their culture, their country. And of course, streamers and global players make local shows. Of course they do. You know,
yeah.
and we can see, you know, there are endless examples of them, and we make them, you know, as well. I mean, you saw an example earlier on, Fool Me Once. That's one of our shows, big hit for Netflix. It's just the consistency and the volume is so different with the PSBs.
Yeah.
Let me just finish this point.
Yeah,
It's
course.
important just to pick up on Tim's point around when you look at some of these big markets. Look, the top 20 shows in the UK over the last 12 months, they're all British. 18 of the 20 are from PSBs. Right? It's essentially the same story in all of the markets. There's a very interesting piece a while back about the French market, about how 15 years ago, the primetime schedules and the highest rating shows in France there were a lot of US imports, almost zero today. And they've been replaced by French and local shows. You know, and that's essentially the same story. Local shows, there is an appetite for them. And when you pitch your, you know, shows to, you know, the Netflixes and the Amazons and the Apples of this world, you know, there is this phrase that about local for local, that local commissioning teams are looking to commission from local producers, and the primary metric of success is to work in the local market. So this thing about resonating with your own community, telling stories about your own country, it's key.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, we've been through conference after conference, Rupert, with these titles of, you know, kind of crisis, you know, all the various things we worry about. 2023, 10 out of 10 were UK PSB shows. I mean, people want something. I mean, and Alex's point about truth is interesting. I do think there's a real challenge for us because and this is not a criticism, news organisations trying to make their economics work will go for more polarisation. They will look at the headlines they write. This is not a criticism, it's just different economic models.
But let me test something.
PSBs can do things differently.
Yeah, let me just test something, because there's a couple of quite reductive themes that I've sort of heard around at the moment. One is the idea that it's either local or it's global, and that actually local stories told, you know, there might be the occasional breakout UK story that does well globally, but actually I wonder whether a creatively vibrant PSB creating amazing UK stories, actually those create a bigger export opportunity for...
Oh, it's an artificial distinction, isn't it? I mean, our business is built, distinctive British content is the bedrock of our business. You know, I mean, you know, we sell our shows around the world. Vera, I mean, you can't get a more British show than Vera. It sells to 190 countries. You know, the soaps, you know, Coronation Street.
Call the midwife. I was there Friday. They told me 200 next countries. I didn't even think there were that
pretty
many
much every
countries,
country. The soaps, you know, the soaps are made in, you know, we sell them to 140 countries.
Yeah.
You know.
But it's also okay to do stuff that doesn't export. I think it's also okay
Yeah,
to invest in
of
content
course.
that only
It's
speaks
both.
to
It's
British
both.
audiences.
Yeah.
It's both.
And where are you then? Similar, the other quite reductive theme that I hear, but which I think came up on the last panel, is this idea that if we're not careful, we become a global. The country becomes a supply arm for, you know, global media producers, because we've got a great skills base and a great facilities base and so on. Again, I don't know if I buy that, but just interesting
I don't think there's anything wrong with being a supply arm as well.
as well.
What you don't want is to become like somewhere where people pop their manufacturing until the tax regime changes, and that's all that exists there. And I think in that panel, people are just saying, don't risk that. You need local origination, well-funded, and us. And then it's fine for people to piggyback off that, because there's lots of skills here, and do manufacturing here. But Julian's point is really key, and Tim made it too, is who owns the IP? Because unless you have the ownership of the IP in British companies, the value doesn't remain in this country. So you have to have original ownership of IP, and the funding and the buying of original ownership of IP comes from here. Otherwise, it's like work for hire, or it's bought out. You need to keep that going in order to ensure that you maintain a creative economy that's of scale. Otherwise, you risk that, just manufacturing, offshoring. But I don't think we're at that point now, but you want both.
Yeah.
No, it's a mixed economy, and it's Alex is completely right. And again, easy to forget, isn't it, that, you know, Communications Act, 20 odd years ago, you know, the British production sector was an eighth the size of what it is today. I mean, it was essentially a cottage industry, and it was going backwards. Communications Act radically transformed the prospects of the UK production sector and the UK creative industry. Its influence can't be understated in many ways.
I was just going to say, I think it's a very healthy paranoia to agree with Alex on IP. So there's no problem with, you know, huge growth in terms of international producers coming in. But I also think we should, as the UK, make sure that we're very careful in terms of how much is locally owned, created and exploited. Because at the end of the day, in terms of if you look at the value chain in this industry, so much is sitting not just in production, it's sitting in IP exploitation. And sometimes I think we tell the creative industries, I mean, I've been banging on about creative industries and driving, but I do think the kind of within that, the quality of earnings is a very, very important topic for the room, which is where is the money coming from, what's work for hire versus, and in the world that we live in, that is highly material to the future of PSB.
And what can we afford?
And what we can afford, exactly right, what we can afford, but also what the strength of our long-term, our balance sheets are to compete. Because you don't want to be in a situation where you just haven't got the resources, even in part, with all the trick shots we're playing on partnership and everything else, you don't want to be into a position where you haven't got that. And I'm certainly, at the top of the BBC, obsessed with the capital we've got, the firepower we've got to do good. And I think we've done, to Julian's point, it is phenomenal what we've done in this country over the last 20 years in terms of growing the industry. And that growth is, it's second to none.
Incredible.
I do think we can keep going, by the way. But I'm very optimistic about it. But I think we should be very, very heads up on some of the deal making we're doing. I think we're also can be a bit muscular about, the UK's got a strong position here.
Yeah, I was going to say, because the affordability is the question I can in an ad market that, let's say, flattish, and a license fee that's been paid.
It's not flat. It's not
Sorry.
flat, the ad market. Remember, digital video advertising is growing,
Yes,
growing.
okay. Yeah.
Linear is shrinking understandably in line with viewing, but it's wrong to say that television advertising is flat. Sorry, go on with
No, that's fair. That's fair. There's a box, I'm in it.
We'll do a BBC Verify on advertising.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
But I suppose, well, and again, this is changing as well, isn't it? But the sort of relative scale of those two pots, will we get to a stage where you're able to fund a PSB linear scale schedule with digital revenues? I suppose the question at the heart of this, and the streamers have been challenging.
Of course we will. Of course we will. Look at how big YouTube is. Look how big digital advertising on YouTube is. Of course we will. That's just a mix shift as the audience moves.
Yeah, I was really relieved to see that this panel was about how we transition to digital and not about whether we can survive, because at least we've moved on from that debate. I feel like we've been in lots of panels talking about whether we can survive. Yeah. And there's an analogy here. It's really difficult.
Sorry, Sarah. No.
It's really difficult to forecast the ad market because anyone who trades in it doesn't ever want to talk it down, because in so doing it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I kind of feel like we have a responsibility collectively not to talk down PSB. Like all the optimism that you can hear is genuinely felt. And we as a market collectively need to hold on to that and take it with us as part of our UK identity, because it is part of our UK identity. You ask the average person in the street about television, they'll tell you they watch the streamers, but they'll talk about their PSB programme. And there's an editorial tone and there's a means of getting to the audiences that we know better than anyone else. And we all have a slightly different tone of voice, and that's appropriate too. Right. We haven't talked about news. There's an election coming up. Channel 5 News is at 5 o'clock. It goes to a different audience than my colleagues. It's brilliant that it should. It's brilliant that Ofcom allowed us to do this. It's brilliant that we can take an ice cream van around the country and talk to people about what they think about politics, and that will be our approach to the election. And everyone else will have their equivalent. Aren't we lucky to be in an ecosystem that supports that diversity of tone and a different editorial approach, but all within a framework that we can stand by, something to be proud of, both in our country and outside it?
And with an assertion of growth to come, which is brilliant. I've realised that we're very nearly out of time. If you don't mind, I might just see whether there's anybody out there who wants to ask a question. So any questions from the floor? I've got one here. We've got...
They're saying you can only have one.
One question, yes.
One.
I saw that. As the lucky hand is there. I'm afraid that we're taking most of the
It's going to take the minute to get them out.
Yeah, sorry about that. So your answer is going to have to be shorter because of the size of the room.
Thank you very much.
Say who you are before you ask your questions, please.
I'm Andrew Derrer, Story Trek. Fantastic listening. Is this a synthesis you may agree with? There's a lot of talk about an ecosystem, of creative ecosystem, completely wonderful. There's a lot of talk about IP. There's a lot of talk about what we do and what we don't do. Is there not a need for the PSBs to have a common platform where content is looked at in terms of a life cycle as opposed to a supply chain. So in other words, where are the areas that we could collaborate on in PSBs where we can deal with that ecosystem fairly, where we look at contributors, where we look at rights, where we look at monetization in a common platform? Is that?
Yeah. Andrew, it's a very quick.
Freely is pretty close to that. Freely is a common platform which allows users in an IP age to bounce off to all of our services with all of our individual brands and content offerings, but working together to collaborate to build something. It's not Project Kangaroo, for everyone who keeps saying so. That was 15 years ago. It's a different one for 2024, but I think that's close to what you're talking about. A means of navigation and discoverability of all of our content in one place.
Brilliant. And on the ambition and the joy of Freely, let me thank the panel, Alex, Julian, Sarah, Tim, very much indeed for your time.